Scripture this morning is from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. When God began creating the heavens and the earth, then the earth was formless and void, and darkness was on the face of the abyss, and the breath of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God separated between the light and between the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, day one. So, we're talking about creation. Who can tell me what this is? What?
The earth.
The earth, the world. Yes, this is what God has created. Who was it that figured out that the earth was round? I don't remember. I'm sorry. I know that Galileo and Copernicus and all those guys were talking about, but I don't know who it was that figured out that the earth was round. But it wasn't the Hebrews. What did they think the earth looked like? They thought the earth looked like this. They existed on a flat surface. They saw rims around the edges, mountains and hills. Did the deep go away? Remember, God or in the first verse it says the darkness was on the face of the deep. No, the deep didn't go away. The deep was all around. What kept the earth from sinking into the deep? The pillars. The earth sat on pillars. And you read in the Old Testament about the pillars of the earth shaking. What was over the earth? The sky. They saw the sun travel across the sky in an arc. And so they thought that there was this firmament, this bowl that sat on the earth, and they existed under the bowl. And the bowl kept the waters above the earth from inundating the earth. So the windows of heaven were open when Noah had built the ark. So, and then the earth, or the sun traveled across this, the moon traveled across this, the stars were pinned to it. So this is the Hebrew conception of the earth, sitting on its pillars. We're talking about beginnings today. We're all familiar with the beginnings of stories. Well, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon. You know, I've been thinking. Once upon a time, long ago and far away, there once was. When I was a kid, we used to beg my grandfather and my dad to tell stories. Once when I was at a family reunion and old enough to know better, meant we were going to hear the story about the bumblebees. Rink Slanker, Bernard Wallen, Jim Studebaker, and I were out in Jim's car. Was how the watermelon story began. We encountered the beginnings of stories in the theme songs of TV shows. Mary Tyler Moore's story began, who can turn the world on with her smile? Who can take a nothing day and suddenly make it all seem worthwhile? We remember, well, let me tell you all a story about a man named Jed. A poor mountaineer barely kept his family fed. Then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground come a bubbling crude. Oil, that is. Black gold. Texas tea. I saw some of you mouthing words. That was how the Beverly Hillbillies story began. And who can forget Gilligan's Island? Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from this tropic port aboard this tiny ship. We encounter the beginnings of stories at the beginnings of stories in literature. It was a dark and stormy night. I have a book by that title, and it contains only the first lines of books. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. 'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the house. Marley was dead to begin with. What kind of stories do you like to hear? What kind of stories do you like to tell? Sabrina used to ask me to tell her stories from when I was a little boy, or from that long ago time when she was little. This when she was about 2 or 3. Why do we tell stories? History. So we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Identity, family stories, national stories. Memory, so that we don't forget significant events. Instruction, to teach the young or the uninitiated. Inspiration, to bolster our courage and confidence. Entertainment, while sitting around a fire. Comfort, such as when a child is going to sleep. Our text this morning is perhaps the best known of beginnings. The creation story, the account of the first day of creation. When I was in seminary, now if you've been following me, you may recognize this as the beginning of the story. When I was in seminary, I had a course called Genesis Exegesis. The class met for 4 hours at a time, once a week, although it felt like more, but not in a bad way. Jean Roop was an excellent teacher, and although sometimes it felt like we had been at the Last Judgment, most times it felt like we had been to church after his class. We spent several weeks talking about the creation stories. You'll be glad to know that I'm not going to try to condense that into this service. But I have learned that it is part of my nature to want to impart knowledge. Evident in my schooling choices, first as a professor wannabe, now as a librarian. When I do this, speak from the pulpit or in Sunday school class, I always try to give people a few morsels to chew on, a new way to look at things, something you didn't know before, so you can go away saying, I never quite considered it that way before. So, in the process of doing exegesis, which is a method of studying biblical texts, there are a lot of things you consider that you never thought of before. And Genesis as a whole, and especially this part, is ripe for this kind of investigation. Here's a laundry list of things that are put up for scrutiny. How have the church and Jewish faith treated the passage over the course of history? What kind of writing is it? Prose? Poetry? A legal document? Are there parallels in the literature and religious traditions of surrounding cultures? And with the creation story, there most assuredly are. What are the similarities? What are the differences? Is it a particular kind of story? Etymology. That's why this place is called Bethel. Etiology. That's how the world came to be. Or that's why we do things this way. Or why we don't do things that way. Is the text pure, for lack of a better term? Has it been played with? Added to? Have things been deleted? Has anything been borrowed? How does our translation compare to others? And how does all this add to our understanding and the meaning we find in the text? In exegesis, nothing is sacred. All questions are fair game. That can be pretty unnerving at first. You take a text that you've known or heard in a particular way all your life, and you put it under a microscope, or you take a knife or a scalpel and cut it up. And it's possible to see a seam here and find that this piece here was lifted word for word from this other story, from an earlier or later text, or from a different culture or faith, Or this story was written much later than originally thought by someone other than who most people think wrote it. What does this mean? Well, to put your mind at ease, when biblical scholars do this, they don't quit in the middle. You keep asking questions. All right, so this was added, and this was deleted, and this was borrowed, and this is repeated. Why? What was the author or editor trying to say to his community of faith by writing what he did or putting it together the way he did? Does that change things for us? What message can we get from the freshly trimmed text, from the re-expanded text, from the text as it stands in the version on the table in front of us? And the last question, does it matter? Well, sometimes, no. But the point of it all is that there can be meaning taken from parts of the whole as well as from the whole. We all experience that when we quote a particular favorite verse. That's definitely a part of a larger whole from which we can take meaning. One of the greatest lessons that we learned is that the text can handle the question. Faith can handle the question. Today's text is not only a part of something larger, it's a part of something larger that's a part of something larger. Genesis 1 to 11 contains lots of prehistory stories. We have the story of the flood. We have the story of the Tower of Babel, the origins of languages. The story of the beginnings of humanity and human relations, of desire, disobedience, love, familial disagreement, jealousy, and murder. And we have the creation stories. And within those stories, we have our text, one part of creation, the prologue and the first day. This is such familiar material, it's often difficult to stop after day one. It's hard not to go into the rest of the story. Creation of the luminaries, separation of the waters, establishment of dry land, creation of birds, animals, sea creatures, and creepers creeping. Creation of man and woman, and on and on. Hard as it is, though, let's look just at these 5 verses, this part of a whole, and see what we can find there. There are several ways verse 1 can be read. 2 are in the beginning, or when God began creating. The first has led to many discussions about whether or not there were 2 creative acts. You may recall I referred to the prologue in the first day. The reason is that beginning with verse 3, God's creative acts are prefaced with the phrase, and God said. Verses 1 and 2 don't have that. So we can ask, had all of this heavens and void formless earth been made ahead of time? Why doesn't it begin, and God said, let there be heavens and earth? It just might be that our writer inserted his creative acts story into the one that began in the beginning. Or perhaps whoever finally wrote down the story thought, and God said, let there be light, was too abrupt a beginning and softened it with, when God began creating the heavens and the earth, then the earth was formless and void, and darkness was on the face of the abyss, and the divine wind moved over the waters. Brings up a different image. The word that is generally translated spirit essentially means air movement, or wind, or breath. Later, God breathes his ruach into man, and he becomes a living being. When a person dies in the Old Testament, his ruach leaves him, his breath. Hebrew thought didn't do spirit. That's Greek thought. So essentially, when we talk about spirit in the Old Testament, we're pinning a much later Greek or even Christian understanding and belief back into a Hebrew writing. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as we acknowledge it as such. But to talk about the Hebrews' understanding of spirit is to put words in their mouths or ideas that weren't really theirs into their heads. It's very easy reading in our time from our perspective To impose our understanding and belief onto a text. That's why studying the text can be so frustrating. Because initially we are called to suspend our point of view. But that's also why studying the text is so cool. It may have meant one thing then to the writer and his audience. It can mean something totally different to scholars, to pastors, to parishioners today. And in the future, readers may have an entirely different understanding and consider our points of view quaint and uninformed, or even primitive. This morning's text is timeless. Literally, time doesn't exist yet. It isn't like the stories of Amenhotep and Ramses, Moses, David, Paul, Galileo, George Washington, etc. They at least have relative, if not exact, dates. This is pre-time. Way back. I mean way back, when God began creating the heavens and earth. This is also a statement of faith. God first, heavens and earth next. God predates it all, and it's different from other creation stories of other cultures. I had a friend in college who really enjoyed different creation stories, and I remember him telling me about one where the two prominent deities fought, and the victor created everything from the body of his victim. Everyone around the Hebrews were polytheistic. They believed in a whole host of gods. So this text says something else. You've heard me say it before. We believe a little differently. We believe in one God who created the world, not from the body of a victim, but in a different way. And they were an anomaly in their culture, in their surrounding cultures. Dark and formless and empty, and the wind moving over the water. Desolate. I have never been at sea or on a body of water far enough that I could not see land, but that's what I envision. It would be pretty dark and pretty desolate. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. Now, how do you imagine this going? Does God have a 6-day to-do list that he crosses things off? What did God do with the rest of day 1? God spoke, light was. What made the light? The sun doesn't show up until day 4. How do you have a day without the sun? Why impose this structure? It's a way of making sense of it. Once you get into the habit of asking questions, sometimes it's hard to know when to quit. There are books written about questions like this, but even I don't want to read those. And God saw the light, that it was good. Does this imply that the darkness was bad? This always made me wonder when I was a kid. I rather liked the dark. I find it rather comforting. When I was in library school, now what are you about to hear? A group of stressed out library students were hanging out in the library one day, talking about being stressed in graduate school. And one of them turned to me and said, "How about you, Lee? What do you do to relax?" I said, "I go home, study for a while, make a cup of tea, turn on some good music, and watch darkness fall." I was surprised at their surprise. "Wow," they said. They seemed never to have heard of such a thing. Have you ever tried it? It's pretty amazing. Colors fade, shadows gather, and there comes a point when individual items are no longer distinguishable. Sunrise is pretty cool too, but I see that less often, and it carries with it, unfortunately, more of the bustle of the coming day. So it troubled me for a while that the darkness wasn't good too. But this comes from another time. I can turn on a light and read. Turn on the stove and cook. Turn on the heat and keep warm. I have walls to keep the wild animals away. If you didn't have fire or lamps or walls, your night could be a lot scarier. Keep in mind, too, that the neighboring cultures thought that the coming of night was when the sun, their chief deity, went down into the abyss, into the underworld, to do battle, and they did not live securely in the knowledge that the sun would win the battle and rise each day. And God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Well, now we learn that while the darkness isn't explicitly called good, it isn't cursed either. There's a well-known proverb that tells us it is better to light a single candle than to curse the darkness. A single candle doesn't dispel the darkness. It just pushes it back a ways. In our story, God brings light into the darkness, but not so that the darkness is dispelled completely. God names the light day and the darkness night, and then sets them in motion so that neither rules totally. There's a period of day, and there is a period of night, and they alternate. The two are separated, yet so that there are these two beautiful blending times that I was speaking of before. And now they too are named in our story. We don't get a creative act for them. God doesn't name them. And notice that the text doesn't say, day passed and night passed, in such a manner that it was light, then dark immediately. It says, and there was evening, and there was morning. I think that is so gentle and poetic and reassuring. Now, remember those folks who lived in fear that day wouldn't come again? Again, this passage is saying, we believe a little differently. There was evening, and there was morning. There is evening, followed by night, and there is morning. There will be times of darkness overcoming, followed by darkness being predominant, followed by giving way to light, followed by a time of light ruling. It's a pattern. It's a cycle. It's order, not chaos. God is in charge. Our God created this. He doesn't have to do battle with it every night. Do you think this might have been attractive to those other cultures surrounding Israel? We hear creationists and evolutionists shouting scientific data and scripture at one another as if either was meant to completely obliterate the other. I'm not here to talk about evolution, but you might recognize this as the beginning of the story. When I was in college, Inherit the Wind, a play about the Scopes monkey trial, was being presented on campus. It was a Southern Baptist campus. There were some in the Ministerial Association that didn't think that this was an appropriate play for a church college, and they were saying so at the beginning of Religions of the World class. Dr. John David Broom was our professor. He said he didn't see anything wrong with it. It was a dramatic production about an historical event. Neither point of view was being presented as the only one, or as that espoused by the college. Then one of the ministerial students asked Dr. Broom, "Do you believe in evolution, Dr. Broom?" Dr. Broom, a deacon at First Baptist Church, and a very wise man, looked at John and said, "I believe God is the author of creation. I don't pretend to know how he did it. God also gave us a mind, and I believe he intends for us to use it." I think his point was that John, the student, was confused about what should be the basis of his faith. What we know as fact today may be disproven and considered primitive in the future, just as the Hebrew worldview is considered primitive by us. Do new truths and discoveries wreck our faith? Only if it's sitting on the wrong pillars. I think the creation story in Genesis 1 is saying the same thing as Dr. Broom, or vice versa. We believe God is the author of creation, and we believe that there will be times of darkness and times of light. And if you sit still long enough, you'll see some really beautiful times in between. And there was evening, and there was morning. It becomes a refrain through the rest of the story. The last words of our passage today, day one, imply imply that we're counting, that there's more to come. And there is. It's a beginning. What kind of beginnings do we experience in our everyday lives? What kinds of first days have we had? Of course, there was our big first day, our day of birth, but we don't tend to remember those early beginnings. To name a few others, our first day of school, grammar school, middle school, high school, college, graduate school, first, second, or third time. First day of a new job, first dates, marriage, birth of children, your own, nieces and nephews, friends, grandkids, grandnieces and grandnephews. First day of retirement. Who remembers that now trite but true saying, today is the first day of the rest of your life? But it is. We have first days after not so joyous life-altering occasions too. December 8th, 1941. November 23rd, 1963. September 12th, 2001. The day after the death of a loved one. These too are beginnings. We don't look forward to these so much. Sometimes we live in fear or dread of them, much like our primitive thinking friends we mentioned earlier, who lived in fear that the sun would not triumph over darkness. Stand firm on the confession of faith. God is in control. God brings order out of chaos. It doesn't matter what science proves. It doesn't matter what is or is not proven to be historically accurate. It doesn't matter who appears to be winning in life. Rest in this. God is the author of creation. We believe a little differently. On each of our remaining day ones, the message is, recognize the darkness. Recognize the light. Acknowledge the light to be good. Acknowledge the dark to be part of the cycle. Does that mean the foundations of the earth will not shake? Does that mean that things will always be easy? Not in the least. But we believe a little differently. We believe God has created us as creative, resilient, compassionate people. In the wake of disaster, the stories of hope eventually surface. We, people of faith, don't write our faith story according to what happens in nature or history. We write our faith story according to what happens here in our minds, here in our hearts, and here among the community of faith. So have hope. There will be evenings